Hello and welcome to the Open Source Hangout, where we discuss development of open source software. This episode is streamed live on August 20th, 2014 at 9 p.m. Central Time. I'm your host, Sean Massa. I'm a software engineer at Groupon, and our co-host is Trek.
I am also a software engineer at Groupon, among many other
How about
things.
that?
So convenient.
Yes, and today we have our special guest, David Pineda.
Hey guys.
Oh. We're going to be talking to him about Buckets.io. But first, we're going to dig into the only one news item this week. Mozilla has announced that if you want to build Firefox OS apps, you should use their new toolchain called Rec Room. And this is basically a collection of some components that they wrote, but also Ember, Handlebars, Grunt, Mocha, Stylus, Yeoman, stuff like that, bundled into this easy-to-use package for Firefox OS apps. It looks pretty awesome. What do you think about it, Chuck?
As someone who uses Ember a lot, I'm obviously a big fan. I think like the biggest cool thing about Rec Room, one is the brick stuff, which is like the list of components that you get to use. But actually, the like secret story in this that nobody's really talking about is Web IDE, which landed in Firefox Nightly's just about a month and a half ago, and that's like a full suite of development tools right in Firefox as a browser. I'm a huge fan of Firefox. I use Chrome on a sort of daily basis for browsing, but like Firefox is definitely my favorite underdog. I think they're gonna save the web someday from our evil Google overlords. Oops, should I be saying that?
Do you know if that Web ID is related to the old Persona stuff?
It is not related to Persona. It's a whole new initiative.
Oh, okay.
So. Some cool stuff coming out of Firefox. Looking super forward to them fixing sort of the web developer tools. I think that's like the key to developer happiness, and developer happiness is definitely a key to mainstream adoption. As you convince developers to use a product, they convince their families every Thanksgiving and Christmas to start using it too. So I'm pretty excited for that. Very excited for like Firefox OS coming out. Cool stuff, I hope, with Firefox Desktop, Firefox Android. So, exciting times.
Yeah, that's awesome. And if anyone wants to look that up, you can search for Rec Room, but we'll have the link in the show notes as well. And that's it for the news. So we're going to do, for the first time, a project spotlight, something that we want to do once in a while, highlights a cool open source project. So today we're going to be talking about Buckets.io. This was written by David Pineda. He's here with us today. And I think we should just start with, like, where did this project come from? Like, how did you get started writing this thing?
Sure. So it was actually, I've been sort of trying to make buckets or just sort of thinking about buckets for a long time. Any first or second year designer developer is going to write their own CMS. That's pretty much guaranteed. But really, over the past couple years, I just the sort of thoughts behind it started to become more concrete, and so last year was the first time I took a real stab at it. At the time, I was a designer in residence at Benchmark, a VC firm out here. And they gave me basically a ton of support. They just wanted me to do it, wanted me to work on it. They could tell I was like really into it. And so that's what I did for about 2 months. And then I basically started to go a little crazy because it was always intended to be open source, but I was sort of waiting for that initial step of quality of having it feel right. And so it wasn't really out there. And so, after 2 months of just sort of every day diving into it, I eventually just sort of hung it up and said, maybe I'll come back to this one day, maybe I won't. And then it was really just the finding assembly a couple months ago, which sort of gave me the impetus to keep going.
So what was your, so we covered assembly in the Hangouts about sort of funding open source projects. How'd you find out about assembly, and what was like the entry process like for that?
I think it was just a tweet from Matthew Smith from Whale, at Whale. And which sort of led me to the site. And I've always, working with some VCs and being a consultant, I've always sort of had a lot of interest in crowdfunding and just sort of crowd-centric platforms. And of course, I think anybody who's done a decent amount of contributing on open source projects has at one point sort of wondered, hey, isn't there some sort of way that, people could monetize this and, in a healthy way? There are things like Git tip and I'm sure plenty of other, incentivizing things, but I thought Assembly's approach was pretty unique.
Very cool. A side note: did you ever use or look at Matt Smith's early pattern tap stuff?
Oh,
I remember being mega addicted to that in 2008, 2009 era.
Yeah,
such a good site.
It's still good, and I think they're
yes, very good.
I believe I saw a tweet. Hopefully I'm not mixing it up with another inspiration thing, but just today or yesterday that they're working on another redesign.
Yes, yeah, they're updating it for sort of the modern world of the world's what applications become in the modern world. That's awesome. So what would you say Assembly has been a success so far, or is it still kind of early in that process?
I think definitely mostly. It's on one hand, it's I don't even make claim to fully understand the legal repercussions, but I think in general, I think they kind of own the project, which is a little odd. I mean, they're absolutely committed to serving the core team of the project and sort of and they work with me all the time. But that's always presents a little bit of wonder and what could happen one day. And then on the other side, I worry sometimes. I think about I guess posting too many bounties on on Assembly and sort of taking people who would think about contributing and just maybe overwhelming them. I don't know. I'm sure a lot of this is just in my head, but that you show up somewhere and you see 500 open tickets or something, which we don't have. We're only around 100 or so. But and you get that feeling of, oh, this thing's never going to get to there, from A to B.
That's it's interesting. I feel like most people get involved in open source projects very, as users or contributor, really late in the game, right? As something like Angular or React or Rails becomes super popular. That's kind of when the typical developer encounters it.
For sure.
Well after the early days. What, if you had to share words of wisdom about people joining in the early days, what would that be?
I would say I think with any project or any sort of diving into any open source thing, just starting small and if you dig the concept or you think, okay, I could see this being useful soon, just start small, find something, because the more time you spend in a code base, the more comfortable you're going to feel. Mm-hmm. And I apologize right now, my cat's walking by. I guess that would be it. And I'm also, that is another sort of interesting part about it being so early on is, I'm open to a ton of things sort of architecturally. Mm-hmm. By no means do I consider myself, I've always been sort of front-end specialist. And so in part half of this project is kind of just for me to really get my feet wet with Node.
Mm-hmm. So what do you think's the minimum viable product for a product like Buckets?
So I've actually spoken a little bit about this before. It's interesting to me because I think in terms of being a product, something that people sign up for, maybe running it as a SaaS app, I actually see that as quite far away and don't really feel the need to rush it to get to that point. I would definitely say, I think somebody asked recently in Assembly, when do you think it would be ready? And I said the best answer I could give is 2015, somewhere within that range. I think on the developer side, if you are a Node developer, I think it will be a very appealing sort of useful product before then. And I'm hoping sort of to have some sort of alpha or beta by the end of this year. But I think to a web designer, when you're coming from things like Expression Engine or Drupal or even WordPress, you have a certain level of expectation around, extensibility, plugins, etc. And if you don't meet a lot of those basic things, I think people aren't going to look at you again for another 2 years.
Yeah. Before we get too much farther, can you describe like what Buckets really is? Like what core features does it have, and what problems it's trying to solve?
So Buckets is a CMS, or a content management system, which is kind of one of the most vague descriptions of something you could have. But in general, and sort of what the web has, the meaning the web has assigned to it is sort of a website management system. And so in that way, you're trying to create this sort of odd balance between something like FileMaker Pro, where you're truly content-centric and it's about schemas and data modeling, like all of that, and facilitating basically database entry, which is super boring and kind of gross. And then you have things on the other side, which are like Tumblr, which is, just super lovely user experience, and it's just about how can I create a blog within the next hour, or that kind of thing, and it's very specifically tailored for web. I actually aim for Buckets to be somewhere in between, where it handles dynamic data really well and smoothly, but is also really easy for web designers to just build front ends with.
So what makes a product easy for quote unquote web designers to use as compared to like other systems out there?
Well, I think for with Buckets, I can say from our point of view, I think the things I'm trying to make easy are, for one, custom data modeling, and which is like a terrible way to say creating a schema, and so that's basically one of our core features, is you create buckets within the app. And I guess to most people, to anybody who's used WordPress, for example, this would be the same as saying you have advanced custom fields plugin built in by default, and a few other plugins. I think like even if you install advanced custom fields in WordPress, search isn't applied to those fields, so you might have to grab another plugin or two, and that sort of thing. So, but all of that within Buckets is basically you say, okay, I'm going to create a bucket for press releases, and every press release will have a city, a time, and a body, and then you can create templates around that. So the data modeling is one thing. The other part is something that other CMSs do quite well, which is exposing content retrieval, sort of querying your database through easy-to-use template tags and through a REST API. And I think a lot of CMSs sort of do one or the other, and I'm definitely intending to do both.
That sounds pretty cool. Let's go back to assembly a little bit. I'm just curious into like how it's working out for you and how you contribute with or communicate with your contributors.
So assembly is pretty cool. I think so for one, there's sort of a very core piece of every project is just a basic chat room, which is just like IRC, and so I check in there fairly constantly. And then there's basically bounties, which are basically GitHub issues, except there's this concept of coins, which represent sort of a virtual breakdown of equity within the app. So if the app begins to make money, if we monetize and it starts to do well, those coin holders will basically get paid out in respect to the percentage of coins they have to the overall pool.
Very cool. And who's on the core team right now?
So for now, it's just me. And I definitely do want to expand that. Because of the way assembly works, core team basically take a little piece, I think like 5% of every bounty that's created. So I'm kind of waiting to find somebody who really sort of shines, who, you know, understands the vision of sort of what I'm going for, but also has the technical skills. You know, basically anybody from the community who just steps up, really. I'd be interested, because I could definitely use all the help I can get.
I believe the term is you're looking for a technical co-founder?
Yeah, sure, except I still want to be a pain and nag about the technical decisions.
Obviously,
yeah. Yeah.
And so does that person need to be someone who's participating on assembly, or do you imagine they could just sort of roll up from anywhere and drop some technical chops?
They definitely could roll up from anywhere, but it would behoove them, I would think, to go through assembly if they're going to commit that level of time. Like I was saying, I think we definitely intend to monetize. Probably not until next year, until 2015.
Yeah.
But yeah, I would think, and also especially because we basically use assembly bounties as our GitHub issues. It tends to be where most of the sort of project management happens. Not just that, but also discussions. People, you know, we're talking about licensing in some threads. We're talking about monetization paths. So yeah, basically, it would be pretty hard for somebody to be involved and not be on assembly at this point.
Very cool. So you mentioned, like, obviously using GitHub. Like, what is the interaction between the data and interactions on GitHub and the data and interactions on assembly? Like, is there a crossover between them? I feel like many open source projects are sort of GitHub exclusively, but you introduced a second system.
Yeah,
how does that play out?
It's interesting. I think we're kind of getting away right now. Like I like the fact that basically we have 0 GitHub issues and they're all in assembly, just in terms of, you know, cleanliness and separation and, like, you know, just knowing where to look for something. I think that's also, though, a product of people aren't using buckets yet. Rightly so. I don't think it's, you know, it's definitely not a production-ready thing in any way yet. But I think, you know, as time goes on, when we get more of the sort of casual users who just have an issue or whatever, I'm sure we'll start to see a lot more issues on GitHub as well. At which point, I guess that might actually be a nice thing, because then we can use assembly sort of as simply a delegation mechanism, or, you know, to plan out bigger things. So
what would you say your plans for the future are? Like, what are the big features that you'd like to add?
There's like hundreds, but
I had to pick like 3.
Yeah, we you know, right now we're definitely very much just trying to get the basics down of editorial permissions. So you have things like draft. You can have contributors to a bucket, but those contributors can't publish things live. They can only submit it to an editor. Those basic types of sort of CMS expected features. The sort of off-the-wall things, and especially the ones that I've been sort of focused on for the past year, have been, for one, the idea of smart buckets or cloud buckets of some sort. And that would basically be, and I hate it when startup people do this, but if you were to imagine if this then that, except instead of triggering actions from social sources, it would simply pull in data.
So it's a little bit like Pinterest for content.
Yeah. Oh, God. However, but I think that sort of thing could be actually really useful in a ton of different ways, I think. like one small example is companies that just show, those sort of promotional, self-congratulating tweets on their homepage. Some companies create a kind of wacky system around faves and things like that. But if you could just say, every time we fave something or every time we tag something with this, it goes into this bucket as a draft, then you just have this sort of, thing to choose from of content that you want to bring into your site.
It's interesting. Do you see? So, who would you say you see as like the primary users of a system like this?
So it's definitely niche. It's targeted. It will be targeted eventually directly to web designers and developers. Because it sort of straddles that line between database management and website creator. I think it's actually going to be somewhat tough to have free-form templates that basically anyone can use, because you're defining your data on the fly, and that sort of impacts your template tags as well. And so, my excuse me. Sorry. So I think people will need to have some base in HTML and CSS in order to create kind of cool sites with it. That said, they definitely shouldn't have to be server-side developers, anything like that. It should be really friendly to front-end people. And so I'm hoping for people or for firms like Paravel or HappyCog or those types of groups, people that would essentially use expression engine, Drupal, systems like that.
That sounds pretty cool. Do you have plans to support, or maybe you already do, like Markdown? Or
yep, actually, so we have a very basic plugin system right now, which basically can only add field types, dynamic field types. And as some of the examples, one of them is a Markdown field. It's not, and that's the thing, there's also, if you're sort of in this space or if you're looking for a solution right now, if you're targeting blogging, Ghost is a fantastic alternative. Ghost is kind of funny because it's we both started around the same time, about a year and a half ago, and we both are using very similar technology. They're also built on Node.js. I don't know about the admin panel. I have to check that out, but
it's all Ember.
Oh, okay, so it is single page app.
Yep.
Yeah, so we have like very. I mean, I've noticed tons of similarities between the two projects. Mm-hmm. Conceptually, though, we're basically just taking WordPress and splitting it in half, and they're taking the side that's good for blogging and doing that really well, and I'm doing the dynamic content side. So design-wise, I don't have that beautiful view yet where you have like the full screen page and just a giant markdown thing, and it feels like you're in like IA Writer or some app like that. I do want to be able to generate that kind of interface at some point, but at the same time, it's very important within the buckets admin interface that maps all sorts of dynamic controls, videos, uploads, things like that are sort of interweaved with the content editing experience.
So let's talk a little bit about the architecture of this. So from like starting at either user interface and going down to how you deploy something like this, or maybe starting at the system level and working up towards the UI, like how would you describe the architecture of this system?
Sure. I guess I'll start on the server side because it's actually a little bit simpler. So, for one, and this is gonna cause some fights, but the entire thing's written in CoffeeScript. In fact, if you look it up on GitHub, they have the language chart. It's something like 85% CoffeeScript and then 15% CSS, which is actually Stylus, but I don't think they respect Stylus yet. And so the entire thing is JavaScript. The server side uses Express. Not much else crazy. It does use Mongoose, and MongoDB is the database right now, which I actually think is going to work great for CMS. And already I think we have benefits from using a NoSQL database that systems like Expression Engine just can't use because they're in MySQL. And so you run into all these weird things with certain systems where they'll add columns to databases, and it's like, custom field _5 and custom field 6 and that kind of thing. And so the ability for us to just say, here's our data, we've already validated it against the fields in another table, and so we want to save the object this way, is actually really convenient for a CMS. Just recently, along similar lines, I also added Elasticsearch. This isn't in the master branch yet. This is sitting in a pull request. But to get some really cool features in terms of fuzzy search matching, suggestions, and even sort of dynamic queries on custom fields. I realize I'm using a lot of words that might not totally make sense right now.
They make sense to me, but only because I've used all these technologies before, so you might want to unpack some of them for people listening at home.
Sure. So again, going back to, it's really easy to create a bucket. I could create a bucket within buckets. I could create a bucket for meetups, let's say, and I have the ability to define fields on that bucket. So I would say, okay, every meetup has a title, a description, a date and time, and a location, which is, all well and good, and then I add all my meetups. But at some point, I may want to say, okay, so I'm going to create a special URL or a special page on my site that shows all meetups in the next week within 30 miles of Chicago. And pretty much, as far as I'm aware, well, maybe Drupal with a lot of work, no other system can do that in an easy way. To be able to query things like geolocation, combined with querying maybe text or querying the date in a really simple, straightforward way. That's actually a really tough thing to do. So, so that's sort of what I mean in terms of the power that Elasticsearch is bringing.
So what technology do you use, like on the front end, to actually render the UI?
Yeah, so that's where it gets a bit messy. First of all, I love Ember, and I see you guys have a bit of a preference for it. And I used to work at Sencha, which also made EXTJS, XJS, which was a JavaScript framework, somewhat similar. Granted, at this point, very different. But I've just personally, in my own projects, never been a fan of frameworks that I guess one would say are too big. And not just that, but also sort of authoritative in how I like to be able to bring my own pieces for certain things. Even though Ember uses handlebars, because of the way it does data binding, it's kind of a gross looking handlebars to me. It's all subjective. But anyway, I'm just talking about stuff I don't like. The bucket's front end is built with Backbone, Chaplin, handlebars for templates, Modernizer, jQuery, and a whole bunch of other things. Moment.js is great. There's probably about, I don't know, at least 10 to 12 packages in our bower. But at the end of the day, I think the entire app comes down to about 200 kilobytes.
Cool.
And it still needs to be optimized, like, badly. I think I still include all of Bootstrap.js in there, and I don't use any of it. Except maybe tooltips, actually.
Awesome. Do you use anything like on top of Backbone to provide a little bit more structure, or do you just go with Backbone
Yeah,
and conventions?
so that's the Chaplin part.
Oh, that's what Chaplin's for.
And yeah, and I'm sure you might be more accustomed to Marionette. They're both very, very similar. They handle child views, disposal of objects. I guess I just started with Chaplin a couple years ago, and I've just always kind of preferred a few of its conventions. But I think they're like Chaplin and Marionette are very similar.
Cool. Do you have like specific bounties, maybe a tag or maybe just a list that you think would be easier for new contributors to get into?
Yeah, I mean there is a tag, and I'm sorry I should for this, but there is a tag called easy or simple or something like that you can filter by. But I would say I mean, there aren't that many bounties. There's maybe 50 or 60. I would say just have a look and just run through, and definitely feel free to sort of hit me up on the chat and just ask me. I usually, I sort of answer people like that all the time. They'll say, hey, I'm thinking about getting started. What should I do? And all I'll ask is basically, do you prefer front end, back end, design, or which combination, and how much of each would you like? And from that, I can pretty much find you a task within a minute or two.
Cool. Sorry, I think we were lagging a little bit there. Chuck, do you have any more questions?
I do, mostly about Elasticsearch stuff. How did you go about designing kind of the? I always forget the Elasticsearch exact terminology.
They're mapping.
Yeah, I mean
the
it's like
schema.
Yeah, the schema, but also they have such weird. Like I've used Elasticsearch in projects, and I never use the right terminology. I just use the stuff I'm used to from other search.
Yeah, it's basically like indexes, indices. I don't know.
Indices, yeah.
And mappings, and then there's advanced features which I haven't even touched yet in terms of filtering or creating my own.
They have streams and rivers, but I think those are going away in favor of something else.
Yeah. So I looked at some river options, which is basically like you said, a stream of the data, but it is an interesting system, and probably for me, just because I'm more of a front end guy and I'm not a super architecturally focused back end developer, I'm having a hell of a time testing this thing because it is extremely async in that you can't even tell it to wait to finish certain things, most things. And so, I'm just throwing timeouts in my tests, and I'm sure I'm going to get yelled at some point. But it is fast, and it does work with dynamic sort of blobs of data. And I'm back to what I think was the original question around mappings. I actually don't know. I have a lot of fears that I have a lot more tests to write before I bring it into the main branch. So it's all working well. If I delete an entry, it deletes the index, or rather the index entry, and if I add an entry, etc. However, I haven't tested the what happens when somebody changes a bucket. If somebody for example, on that meetup bucket, if they were to remove the location field, which is a map with X, Y, or longitude, latitude coordinates, and they replaced it with a field called location, which was a text field, I'm sure we'd run into some issues. I think there are actually some very cool features around aliases, so you can actually sort of just alias your index name and then basically create a new mapping, drop the old one, and the alias, and then just update the alias to point to the new one. Anyway, this is stuff I literally was reading about yesterday, so I'm by no means am I an authority to talk about it.
The hardest, what I've always found hard in Elasticsearch is figuring out does your search schema match your data persistence schema? And I can never find anyone that will give me like just a straight answer of like, yes, absolutely, or like, that's crazy. You would totally change the way the schema works to like optimize it for searching.
Yeah, you can. The power is definitely there. I mean, and you know, on a technical side, it is massively impressive, the performance and the, you know, for some of its features. And I have, of course, I'm sure anybody who sort of discovers Elasticsearch, starts playing, starts, you know, integrating it with their product, goes through that same sort of process where they start thinking, okay, now how do I drop my database and just use Elasticsearch? And I think some people have done it, but I'm not going to pursue that.
Yeah, I mean, from everything I've heard, that it is specifically not what Elasticsearch is designed to do. Although it's so tempting, right? Because you look at it, you're like, it is, yeah, totally. It feels like a document store that's more performant than Mongo. Like,
it looks like it.
Yeah, like, why do I need two of these?
Yeah. You know, part of me thinks it actually could be if they could just, you know, have
the data consistency problem solved.
Yeah, no, yeah, just, you know, provide a wait option, you know, like only return this thing once you know you're done. But yeah, it's timeouts for now.
Very cool. So you mentioned you're kind of new to Elasticsearch. Like, as you're designing a product like this, like how do you discover new technologies and figure out like what you want to adopt and what you don't adopt?
I mean, I'm doing it all the time. I think in certain situations, it's very clear cut. I think, what was it? So it's funny, you guys were talking about Mozilla, and like just recently, I've been sort of finding a ton of Mozilla node libraries to be. I'm forgetting the name right now, but they're just for configuration files. So it's like an NPM module that basically gives you a very simple JSON format to specify, you know, a config value, but also its env name, if it can be an env variable, and then also its argument name. And so it creates this, you know, sort of nesting effect where you know, the env overrides the default, and the the param, or the passed option, overrides the env. And in situations like that, and it's like a small NPM module, and I just think it's a no-brainer, and I just bring it in. This Elasticsearch thing is definitely the biggest sort of architectural shift I've gone through, and sort of my way of thinking about buckets and how I was going to accomplish buckets. But I have sort of always thought that since the beginning that, you know, in being a content management system, especially because the templates and being able to bring dynamic data via asynchronous template tags into a template as fast as possible, and using various, you know, params that template authors are passing in, that's sort of a super critical piece of the CMS equation, you know, as well as a nice REST API for searching and those types of things. So it just seemed to fit, especially after I played around with text search within Mongo for a week or so. I realized pretty quickly.
Yeah, I will not pile on Mongo, but I would say text search is of the many things that are not great in Mongo, that is probably the most not great part.
Yeah, I think that's what it was, actually. It was about a week and a half ago, and I started to write just a search. You know, I throw a search box into the UI and throw in an API endpoint and Express, and then I start looking into the Mongo docs, and I'm like, oh, you could do a regex, or that's it.
So you've mentioned a lot of technologies that are sort of server-side related. Like, how do you think people are going to go about deploying this if they decide to sort of run it on their own? You know, what are all the necessary techs, and how would you recommend the various they get deployed across machines in a kind of cluster?
Yeah. So I mean, this probably doesn't address, large-scale deployments or sort of enterprise-level deployments. But I will say the deploy to Heroku button that they introduced within the past week, I just think for an app like Buckets, it's awesome. It's so sort of brilliant to be able to say, here are the 4 services we need. We need Elasticsearch, we need Mongo, we need Mail Server. And to just have them sort of bundle it up, give you free plans on all those other things, and just sort of deploy it for you. So we integrated that on the first day, actually. And that was like, I just think that's super cool. Ultimately, I think, as we sort of get to that beta, I think that option will still be there, but I think the preference will be to deploy it as an NPM module. I do intend for Buckets to be able to act as middleware within an NPM or a Node application. So, I think the NPM module will definitely be more attractive to Node developers. In fact, I kind of hope my goal is sort of a secret goal, sort of secondary to serving web designers, is that Buckets can sort of become the Django admin UI for like in the Python world. It's basically this de facto scaffolding tool. Anyway, so.
That sounds awesome. Do you have any final thoughts before we wrap up?
No, I mean, I would just say, please contribute, and by that I don't mean just start submitting pull requests, but those are welcome. But we definitely, especially through this sort of assembly system, I love the idea that anybody can contribute, even if they are content strategist in New York or something, and just sort of want to say, here's what I want to see in a CMS. Here's why WordPress or Drupal is always such a pain for me. I consider anything like that a contribution. And so I would say if you're interested in a CMS and you just want to know when is a cool CMS going to be ready, go to Buckets.io. There's some basic info. There's you can sign up with your email. If you are interested in contributing feedback or code or designs, check it out on Assembly, assembly.com/buckets.
Awesome. Trek, do you have any final thoughts?
Only to reiterate, go participate in open source, either something like this or sort of whatever you want to help out in. There's so much work to be done to make the world a better place, and every little bit definitely counts.
Yeah, for sure. And for me, Buckets looks like a really interesting solution, especially when it's farther along and you recommend using it in production in an enterprise.
Yeah, I'll probably be doing a new screencast soon because there was one up on the Buckets page, but it's about a month or 2 old now, and it's come a long way.
That's a month or 2 is very old for early stage beta open source software.
Totally, yeah.
You need to do that weekly.
In fact, I think at one point I say, I wanted to do it weekly, and I just tough.
Yeah.
Every time I try to record myself, it's like a nightmare. But I think in that video, I get to I create a bucket, and then there's no field editing or anything. So I'm like, just imagine I could add, a title or a map. So thankfully, at least some of those fields are in at this point.
Awesome. All right, well, that's going to bring us to the end. I want to thank Trek and David especially for talking to us about Bucket.io, and thanks to all of our viewers for watching the Open Source Hangout. You can check us out every p.m. Central on Wednesdays, and you can keep up with the show at opensourcehangout.com, and we'll see you next week.